A billionaire married her only to keep up appearances, never intending to love her. To him, she was just decoration, beautiful, silent, and easily ignored. But one night, when he walked into the bathroom and saw her crying in nothing but a towel, everything changed. This is the story of how a cold billionaire's heart learned to beat for love. Braxton Hale was 32 years old and carried himself like a man who had already conquered the world. Every step he took was precise, every word calculated, every smile practiced. The glass towers he owned sparkled under the city sun, and every business deal he touched turned to gold. But his personal life? Cold, controlled, empty. Love was not in his vocabulary. He believed it made men reckless. It was business that gave him power, and he guarded that power like a fortress. Then came the condition in his grandmother's will. Before he could inherit the historic Hale estate, a mansion older than the city itself, he had to marry. Not for love, not for family, just marry. On paper, it was simple. In his heart, it was nothing more than another business transaction. So Braxton set out to find the perfect candidate, not a woman who would challenge him, not one who would demand his time or affection, but one who would look the part, a stunning accessory to his already flawless image. That's when he saw her, Caroline Blake. She wasn't dripping in diamonds or surrounded by admirers. She was behind the counter of a small-town bakery, dusted in flour, her hair pulled back messily, yet her blue eyes caught the light like the ocean at dawn. She smiled at an elderly man buying bread, and it wasn't the fake smile of someone trying to impress. It was warm, genuine, the kind of smile you felt in your chest. Braxton watched her for a moment too long. She didn't know who he was. She didn't care. And that was exactly why she was perfect. When he approached her with his proposal, not of love but of a contract, Caroline froze. The terms were clear. She would become Mrs. Caroline Hale. She would attend events on his arm, wear the finest gowns, and smile at the right moments. In return, he would settle a debt that had been crushing her family for months. At first, she refused. But then she thought of her younger brother, barely 17, with dreams of going to college. She thought of the debt collectors who called every night, their voices cold and threatening, and she thought of how little choice she really had. Braxton's final words sealed her fate. "You will be taken care of. No one will hurt you. But this is not a love story, Caroline. This is an arrangement." She nodded, hiding the sting in her chest. She had learned long ago not to expect fairy tales. The wedding was small, private, elegant, just as Braxton wanted. She wore a gown worth more than the bakery she once worked in, but it felt like borrowed skin. Braxton looked handsome in his tailored suit, but his eyes stayed cool even as they said their vows. When the rings were exchanged, she felt the weight of it, not the metal, but the reality. She was no longer Caroline Blake, the girl from a small town. She was Caroline Hale, wife to one of the most powerful men in the country. Yet she was nothing more than a beautiful piece of decoration in his perfectly curated life. That night, in the vast Hale mansion, she unpacked her single suitcase in a bedroom that felt more like a display than a home. Braxton had his own separate room across the hall. His parting words before closing the door were simple. "We have an event next Friday. I'll have the dress delivered." Caroline sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She had traded her freedom for security, her heart for her brother's future. And though the house was filled with priceless art and sparkling chandeliers, it had never felt emptier. The marriage of appearances had begun, and neither of them knew how deeply it would change them both. The Hale mansion was a masterpiece, the kind of place people took pictures of when they passed by, whispering about the wealth behind its gates. White stone walls rose high against the sky, and tall windows reflected the city lights like mirrors. Inside, the floors were pure marble, cool underfoot, polished until you could almost see your reflection. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, scattering light across gold-framed paintings that had been in Braxton's family for generations. Every inch was perfect, every detail carefully chosen, and yet it was lifeless. To Caroline, it felt less like a home and more like a museum where she was not allowed to touch anything. Every sound she made, footsteps, the clink of a glass, echoed back at her, reminding her just how alone she was. Dinner was always the same. A long dining table that could seat 20, but only 2 chairs were ever used, one at each end. Braxton would eat in silence, eyes sometimes on his phone, sometimes on the business reports spread beside his plate. If he spoke, it was about the next event, the next trip, the next arrangement she had to be ready for. He was polite, always polite, but never warm. Not once did he ask about her day, her thoughts, or her feelings. Not once did he touch her hand just to feel her skin. The only time his arm circled her waist was when cameras were watching. Charity galas, networking dinners, high society luncheons. Then he would smile, lean close, and make her look like the most cherished woman in the room. But as soon as the event was over, the space between them would return. Caroline learned to play her role well. She smiled when expected, laughed softly at conversations she barely listened to, and wore the gowns his personal shopper sent her way. She told herself she didn't need anything more. After all, she had agreed to this. It was her choice. Her brother's tuition was paid, the debt was gone, and her life was comfortable. But comfort was not the same as happiness. And in the quiet hours, she felt it, the ache of being unseen. One late night, unable to sleep, she wandered to the hallway near Braxton's office. She heard his voice through the half-closed door, deep and steady, speaking into the phone. She didn't mean to listen, but the words stopped her in her tracks. "She's not my wife in the way you think. She's just here because it looks good." Her breath caught. It was like the air had been pulled from the room. The words were casual to him, but to her they were a blade, cutting through the small hope she had been secretly nurturing, that maybe, just maybe, he might see her one day as more than a name on a contract. She stepped back quickly, pressing her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Her heart pounded painfully, her chest tight. By the time she reached her bedroom, the tears had already begun to fall. They were hot, unstoppable, sliding down her cheeks in silence. She curled up in the bed, clutching the pillow to her chest, trying to muffle the quiet sobs that broke free. The mansion was beautiful. The life looked perfect, but she had never felt more invisible, more replaceable, more utterly alone. And somewhere deep inside, a small crack had begun to form in her heart. A crack she feared would one day break her entirely. 3 weeks had passed since the night Caroline overheard those crushing words. She hadn't told him she heard. She hadn't confronted him. Instead, she became quieter, her smiles softer but emptier, her eyes clouded even when dressed in diamonds. That evening, they attended yet another gala. The room was filled with glittering gowns and champagne flutes, laughter echoing beneath crystal chandeliers. Braxton, as always, played the perfect gentleman, his hand at the small of her back, his smile charming, his voice confident. To anyone watching, they looked like a couple deeply in love. But when the night ended, Caroline slipped into the waiting car alone. Braxton stayed behind, speaking with a group of investors, his mind already far from her. The Hale mansion was silent when she entered. The staff had gone home for the night. The air felt too still, the kind of stillness that made every emotion sharper, heavier. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her heels clicking against the marble. Once inside, she kicked them off, her gown pooling on the floor moments later. She stepped into the bathroom, turned on the shower, and let the steam fill the space. The hot water ran over her, but instead of soothing her, it seemed to break her open. She had been holding it in for too long, every moment of feeling unseen, every second of pretending it didn't matter. Tears slipped down her cheeks, mingling with the water, and then she sobbed. Not quiet, controlled tears, these were deep, aching sobs, the kind that made her chest hurt. She slid down to the tiled floor, curling her knees to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them. Her wet hair clung to her face, and her shoulders shook uncontrollably. She didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway. She didn't hear the soft creak of the bathroom door opening. Braxton had come upstairs to speak to her about an upcoming business event. But the moment he stepped inside and heard her, he froze. It wasn't the sound of a woman simply upset. It was the sound of a heart breaking in real time. His gaze moved to the fogged glass of the shower door. Through the haze, he saw her, small, fragile, folded in on herself as if trying to disappear. The sight hit him in the chest like a blow. This wasn't the polished, poised Caroline he presented to the world. This was someone raw, hurting, human. Without thinking, he grabbed a towel from the rack and stepped inside. The steam wrapped around him, the heat making his breath catch, but it was nothing compared to the tightness in his chest at seeing her like this. He knelt beside her, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. "Caroline, why are you crying like this?" She looked up slowly, and the sight made him still. Her eyes were red and swollen, her cheeks blotched from the heat and tears. There was no anger in her expression, just exhaustion. A kind of defeat he hadn't realized she carried. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Because I'm nothing to you, Braxton. I'm just decoration." The words cut deeper than he expected. For a moment, he had nothing to say. The truth was there, staring him in the face. And for the first time, Braxton Hale, the man who always had an answer, found himself speechless. That night, after leaving Caroline's bathroom, Braxton didn't return to his office. He went to his study, but the papers on his desk blurred before his eyes. The image of her on the shower floor, vulnerable, broken, played again and again in his mind. For years, he had believed distance protected him. Love was messy, distracting, dangerous to a man with goals as sharp as his. But seeing her like that made him realize something. His distance hadn't just protected him, it had destroyed her. She had stepped into his world, leaving behind her freedom, her small-town dreams, her comfort, all to keep a promise. And what had he given her in return? A cold house, a cold husband, a role to play but no life to live. That night, for the first time in years, Braxton couldn't sleep. When dawn broke, instead of putting on his suit and heading straight to work, he went to the kitchen. The staff wouldn't arrive for hours. The silence was heavy, but he moved through it with a strange, unfamiliar determination. He made her breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. When Caroline came down, her hair still damp, eyes still tired from crying, she froze at the sight. "You cooked?" she asked softly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if she spoke too loud. "Sit," he said gently. "Eat." At first she was cautious. She picked at the food, watching him as though waiting for the catch. But Braxton didn't speak about business or events. Instead, he asked, "What's your favorite music?" Her brows furrowed in surprise. I don't know. I like the old records my dad used to play." He nodded slowly, as if storing that piece of her away. "And your favorite food?" She blinked at him, then smiled faintly. "Strawberry pie, homemade." Braxton felt something warm stir in his chest at the small smile. And so it began. In the days that followed, he asked more. What colors she liked. What places she wanted to see. What dreams she had before she became Mrs. Hale. One afternoon, while she was sketching quietly on the patio, he noticed the way her eyes lit up when she talked about painting. The next day, he made a decision. While she was out, he had one of the unused rooms in the mansion transformed. The curtains were pulled wide to let in the morning sun. Canvases leaned against the wall, brushes and paints lined the shelves, and an easel stood ready in the center. When Caroline saw it, she stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth. "This is for me?" she whispered. Braxton nodded. "For you." Something in her eyes softened that day. She started painting again, sometimes for hours, lost in her colors and strokes. And he started joining her in the evenings. They no longer sat at opposite ends of the dining table. Braxton pulled his chair beside hers, their meals shared with quiet conversation or laughter. He surprised himself by helping her wash the dishes afterward, water dripping from his sleeves as she teased him for being terrible at it. But the change he treasured most came slowly. It was in the sound of her laughter, soft at first like it had forgotten how to exist, then brighter, freer. It filled the mansion in a way crystal chandeliers and gold-framed art never could. And Braxton realized something dangerous. Her laughter wasn't just beautiful, it was becoming his favorite sound in the world. The sun was sinking low, painting the walls of Caroline's studio in warm gold. She stood at her easel, a smear of sky-blue paint on her cheek, her hand moving in soft, steady strokes across the canvas. Her hair was loosely tied back, a few strands falling forward, and her expression was one of pure peace, a sight Braxton had learned to treasure quietly from the doorway. That evening, he didn't just watch. He stepped inside, the sound of his shoes muffled against the rug. Caroline turned, surprised to see him lingering after work hours. "You're home early," she said, tilting her head. "Maybe I just missed you," he replied, his voice low. Her cheeks warmed, though she tried to hide it by looking back at her painting. But when she glanced again, she noticed his hands, one of them holding something behind his back. "What's that?" she asked, curiosity threading her tone. He took a slow step toward her, his gaze steady on her face. And then, with a small exhale, he revealed what he had been hiding, 2 simple, slightly crumpled tickets. Caroline blinked. "Bus tickets?" "To Crest Wind," he said. "That little coastal town you told me about. The one where you said the air smells like salt and cinnamon." Her lips parted in shock. She had mentioned Crest Wind only once, in passing, while talking about her childhood. "Why?" she asked softly. Braxton's hand tightened on the tickets as if they were his lifeline. "I don't want to show you off anymore, Caroline," he said, his voice trembling in a way she had never heard before. "I want to love you. Not because a paper says I have to, but because I can't breathe without you." The words hit her like a wave, soft but unstoppable. This was the same man who had once walked past her without meeting her eyes, who had spoken to her like a business arrangement. Now his gaze held something raw, something unguarded. Her chest ached, but not with the old pain. This was something new. "Hope." "When do we leave?" she whispered. His lips curved into a small smile. "Tomorrow." The next morning, they boarded the bus. No security guards, no assistants, no expensive cars trailing behind. The ride took hours, but neither minded. They sat close, his hand over hers, talking in quiet tones about everything and nothing. For the first time, Braxton didn't look at his phone once. When they arrived, Crest Wind welcomed them with the scent of the sea. The salty breeze tangled Caroline's hair as they walked along the boardwalk, the cries of seagulls echoing above. They stopped at a tiny shop where the owner recognized her excitement and piled her ice cream high with strawberries, her favorite. Braxton took a bite of his and made a face at the unexpected tartness, which made her laugh so hard she nearly dropped hers. They wandered through narrow streets lined with pastel-painted houses, peeking into small bookstores and seashell shops. By evening, they found themselves barefoot on the beach, the tide cool against their toes. Caroline tipped her head back to look at the sky. The stars were spilling across it like scattered diamonds, the moon hanging low and golden. Braxton watched her, his gaze softer than the sea breeze. "You belong in moments like this," he said quietly. She turned toward him. "And you?" His lips curved faintly. "I only belong where you are." There were no photographers there to catch the way she leaned into him, no headlines to capture how he held her like she was both fragile and unbreakable at the same time. It was just them, and the sound of waves, and the warmth between their joined hands. For the first time, their marriage felt like it belonged to them, not to a contract, not to an inheritance, not to anyone else's expectations. And Caroline realized this was the beginning of something that didn't need signatures or rules. This was love, real, unshakable, and theirs. The Hale mansion no longer echoed with silence. The halls were alive now, with the scent of fresh coffee in the morning, the sound of Caroline's soft humming in the studio, and the quiet laughter that often spilled from the dining room. The long dining table, once a cold and distant stretch of polished wood, was now cluttered with shared breakfasts, sketchbooks, and the occasional paintbrush Caroline had forgotten to put away. And every morning, without fail, Braxton kissed her before leaving for work. Not a quick formal brush of the lips, but a lingering, gentle kiss that said, "I see you. I love you." Caroline had never imagined she would be truly happy here. But the truth was written in the little things. Braxton bringing her tea when she painted late, her surprising him at the office with lunch, the way they reached for each other without thinking when they passed in the hall. One bright Saturday, they attended a community charity event in the city. It was a gathering meant to raise funds for youth programs, bringing together families from every walk of life. Caroline stood at the edge of the park for a moment, watching her husband. Braxton, The man who once measured worth by bank accounts and last names was kneeling on the grass, eye level with a group of children. They were from different races, different backgrounds. Some shy, some chattering excitedly as they showed him their handmade crafts. He didn't glance at his watch. He didn't scan the crowd for someone more important to speak to. Instead, he listened, really listened. Caroline noticed the way he asked about their dreams. "What do you want to be?" he asked a little boy with dark curls, his voice warm and sincere. "A pilot," the boy said, grinning. Braxton smiled. "Then you fly higher than anyone ever has. Don't let anyone tell you you can't." A little girl with braids shyly offered him a drawing of a house. "That's beautiful," Braxton told her, his tone reverent. "I'd live there in a heartbeat." Caroline felt her chest tighten, not with sadness but with a deep, overwhelming pride. The man before her wasn't the cold billionaire she had married. This was someone transformed, someone who understood that greatness wasn't about wealth or appearance. It was about kindness, respect, and seeing people for who they truly were. As the event ended and people began to pack up, Braxton walked back to her. The late afternoon sun lit his face, and there was a softness in his expression reserved only for her. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close so their foreheads nearly touched. "You taught me what love really is," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "And I'll spend the rest of my life showing the world it's never about how someone looks. It's about who they are inside." Her throat tightened, and tears welled in her eyes, not the lonely, bitter kind from that first night, but the kind born of joy so full it ached. "I didn't teach you," she said quietly. "You let yourself learn." He smiled faintly and kissed her, there in the fading sunlight, with no care for who saw. They left the park hand in hand, but the moment stayed with Caroline. She thought of the woman she had been, a silent ornament in a cold house, and the man Braxton had been, untouchable and unfeeling. And she saw how far they had both come. Their love had begun as a transaction, bound by rules and appearances. But now it was bound by something unbreakable. It had taught them both that walls, whether built from pride, fear, or prejudice, could be torn down. And together they would keep tearing them down. In their home, there would be no walls of judgment, no ceilings on dreams, no locked doors between hearts. Because love, they had learned, had no prejudice. It saw no color, no rank, no boundaries. It simply saw the soul and embraced it. Caroline smiled up at Braxton as they walked. She had once been just a decoration. Now she was the reason a powerful man's heart had opened wide enough to welcome the world in. And together they were living proof that when love is real, it has no walls, no prejudice, and no limits.